بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستجيره ونستنصره ونستهديه فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونسألك يا الله يا علي عظيم أن تصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا وأن تصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا وأن تصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا وأن تجعل الحياة زيادة لنا وأن تجعل الحياة زيادة لنا في كل خير وأن تجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر واللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه الميامين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. We all know these truths that are undeniable in our lives. We are all aware of the fragility of life. Life is fragile. And it demonstrates its fragility all the time. It is remarkable the extent to which human beings are surrounded by certain realities. The reality of death and regeneration occurs every second in our lives, millions or billions of times. But we are oblivious. We all know that we cannot exist if the cells in our body, if millions and millions of cells didn't die, and millions of cells regenerate, without that occurring, nothing would be. We are all surrounded every second by living things that used to fly in the sky, that used to crawl in the ground, that expire. And yet, the logic of existence comes back time and time again. Our children, as are we, we grow up, we continue aware of pets that we used to love, that we've seen die, of human beings that we used to love, that we've seen die. And ultimately, although we are fully aware of our own consciousness, we don't quite understand what it means for this consciousness to expire. But yet we are sure that but for the grace of God your consciousness can easily expire. We are but a virus away from expiration. We are but a heart attack away from expiration. We are but an accident away from expiration. Anything and everything takes away human beings every day, and we witness all of that. The very logic testifies all the time that the Maker, the King, the Lord, the owner of this existence has created the logic of death and created the logic of regeneration. Yet, it is very easy for us to be oblivious to this fact and to exist in the greatest act of non-realism, while so many of us grow up believing that we are so intelligent, so sophisticated, because we're realistic human beings. And religion for us is often placed in the category of the unrealistic. Indeed, in reality, the most unrealistic thing is those who exist oblivious to the logic of existence that surrounds them all the time. And the logic is everything dies, and you will die. And death could come any second, any moment, at any time. And that the regeneration and consciousness persists despite death. What are the chances? What are the chances that a singular unified logic persists in all the known and unknown, all the known universes? The logic of death and regeneration. What are the chances that this can just simply occur happenstance? Why does this entire universe follow singular laws of physics that seem ironclad, unbreakable, impenetrable? The absolute absurdity that this universality and uniformity can persist throughout in this vast universe, the mathematical logic to existence, the fact that all of this would occur happenstance, simply by coincidence, is the singular act of unrealism there is. It is nearly borders on the insane to believe that it is just because it is. one must concede, that the net of the logic of existence is so tight, so pronounced, that if one has any level of intelligence, one is forced to pay attention. Yet, everything in our lives, everything that modernity has produced, everything that is the result of industry and the investment of capital and the logic of people selling things and people profiting from things, everything is designed to distract us from the inevitability and the impenetrable, ironclad logic of death. Everything that we watch, everything that we read, everything that we buy, everything that we engage in, even the food we eat, the clothes we wear, is designed to distract us from the inevitability of death and to get us not to think beyond that inevitability. All of us know we will die. You cannot escape it. And know that death can come at any time, as it does all the time. But then what? What happens after death? The possibility is you lived, you died, and you're gone. The possibility is that you live and you die and then you're gone. You disappear. Your birth is meaningless and your disappearance is meaningless because entire existence is meaningless. After all, if that is what you believe, then you have no answers as to how this universe is the result of such universal and uniform laws. You have no answers as to the symphony of existence. And you ultimately have no answers as to why you matter. Coincidence created you, and coincidence takes you away, and you will be forgotten like billions and billions of human beings that came to this life and disappeared. And even if you remember, you are remembered in books of history, even if you're a Mozart and Beethoven, or a Napoleon or Hitler, ultimately, if death is the end, the memory doesn't matter. The irony is the logic of atheism is that the memory of Hitler The memory of Hitler is equal to the memory of Mother Teresa. It's all the same. Because once you die, Hitler is no longer, and Mother Teresa is no longer, as you are no longer, and it really doesn't matter. Because the pretend world we play in is anchored in unrealism. If nothing means nothing, if all means nothing, if there is no meaning beyond death, then why does it matter if I'm remembered as a serial killer or a great moral teacher? After all, I'm dead. And the pretend world where we say, oh, you live on in your legacy, it's a completely crazy, insane idea, because you don't live on. The fact that anyone remembers you doesn't make any difference. The only way for anything to mean anything is, in fact, if after death the story goes on. Is, in fact, if after death there is resurrection and there is accountability, and then there is meaning. Our children love to think that they are independent, critical, analytical thinkers. Our children struggle searching for that human impulse where they have a sense of the self and a sense of dignity and a reason for self-respect. But what we need to become much better at and what we need to educate ourselves about is the extent to which the cards are decked against our children. Because everything from the moment our children enter their first nursery is designed to get them not to think about death. Everything from the time our children enter into nursery, the phones they carry, the computers they turn on, the programs they watch, even the teachers that we supply to teach them at school, are all designed, all calibrated to tell them, if someone you know dies, mourn, but the most important thing is to go on, to live on. Don't think too deeply about death. Distract yourself. And definitely don't think about what happens after death. And most definitely, don't think about what if after death, hellfire and punishment turn out to be true. Are you going to be safe? Are you okay? It is not an exaggeration to say that the way modernity has structured itself is around the logic of capital return. We need to organize things so that those who have capital can invest it and have a return on it. That's the logic of modernity. And in order for those who own capital to have a return on their investments, they can't afford to have our children think too deeply about the meaning of existence. The very logic of capitalism is the logic of distraction and heedlessness. That is the embedded logic of capitalism. And that is precisely why everything, even law, economics, philosophy, psychology, is all organized around the idea that it is unhealthy and undesirable to think about death and the consequences after death. Everything. And our children never get an opportunity to understand that, except for perhaps the most rare of them, and usually towards the end of their lives, if they have the opportunity to get old. It is not enough that we simply communicate to our children Quran and Ahadith and prayer and fasting and tell them, here is the ibadah, off you go, be a good Muslim. We need to think deeply about our world and teach our children to think deeply about our world and to confront full on the simple question of what if after death you face hell and punishment and accountability. Are you ready? Because thinking about what will happen to you in the future is precisely what it takes to be a realistic human being. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم اسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين يا رب العالمين. How do we help our children make sense of this world? What is this world to them? the case of Muslim children, all Muslim children are supposed to understand that it is a critical part of their faith, that they have to think about Islam and Muslims as a single ummah. We are but one people, united by the belief that there is no God but God, and that all the prophets, from Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, to Musa, Moses, to Isa, Jesus, to all the prophets until the final prophet Muhammad, came forth with the same basic message. And that Allah doesn't need our ibadah and our worship, but that Allah decreed ibadah and worship for our own good. Because it teaches us to be moral, ethical beings. And that is precisely why, if you teach children to worship Allah, but you don't explain to them how worshiping Allah translates into an ethical, conscientious, moral, intelligent existence, the very logic of religion falls apart. And we as Muslims confront this challenge more than any group in the world today. Because we as Muslims, wherever we turn, we see a world that has become remarkably adept at persecuting and targeting and tormenting Muslims. From the days of Bosnia and the Bosnian genocide, to the Palestinian genocide, to the genocide in Burma, to the genocide in China, to the rise of Islamophobia, it is as if Shaitan himself looked upon the world and thought the last bastion of realism, the last bastion of logic, the last bastion of ethics and morality is Islam. And so that has to be targeted. It is remarkable that in the same way that there is a human being that can be surrounded by the logic of death all the time, and yet think of their own death as such a remote possibility. As equally atrocious are human beings who are surrounded by the logic of human suffering all the time, and yet exist oblivious to it. If Islam is the bastion of morality, again, the very logic of morality is how do you treat and deal with others? Well, how can you have immoral order if you are not taught to think about others? In concrete terms, if Islam is about morality, then how can you raise someone to be a Muslim if, for instance, there is an atrocious genocide taking place in China where Muslims are targeted and murdered and imprisoned and tortured, and you raise someone to quote unquote be a Muslim, but they never think about those who suffer under this genocide, and they organize their lives completely oblivious to the suffering of others. They think that their lives, because of the way they're taught, is about them, what they will do when they wake up, what they will do before they go to sleep, what they will do with their careers, what they will do with their lives. And they're never taught. It's not about that. It is about what you will do for others. Because that is the logic of morality. If you live for yourself, then you're an immoral human being. And there will be consequences after you die. No, we teach them that Allah wants you to worship, Allah wants you to fast, Allah wants you to do this, Allah wants you to do that. But we don't teach them what really matters. The very logic of justice is that Allah gives victory, supports those who are raised to serve a cause, i.e., to serve others. It's remarkably frustrating. I watched, in my life, I grew up watching Palestinians suffer under Israeli occupation. And I've watched so many Muslims live and die, completely oblivious. Eventually, added to the ranks of Palestinians, I've watched the intimate details of Bosnian Muslims suffering, the atrociousness of the rape camps, and Muslims were largely oblivious. Then, before we know it, added to the plight of Burmese Muslims, then the plight of the Uyghur Muslims, and lest we forget the plight of Chechnyan Muslims who underwent a genocide that is completely been forgotten by the vast majority of Muslims. In fact, some of the people that tried to remind you others of the Chechnyan genocide ended up being thrown in Guantanamo simply for being activists on the Chechen issue. And now, a new genocide against Muslims is imminent, according to report after report and article after article. Yet another extremely detailed article about what it titles the imminent genocide against Muslims, 200 million Muslims in India. An already ongoing genocide against Muslims in Kashmir. But the latest is some guy who is influential in Indian politics called Pooja Shakun Pandey, calling for the immediate extermination of all Muslims in India. And all the details about acts of violence and deafening anti-Muslim rhetoric in India. And as I read an article like this, I'm reminded of all the Muslims who would say to me, why are we making such a big deal about Palestinian Muslims? We should move on. After all, are they the only people who suffer? And then eventually they said the same thing about Bosnian Muslims. And eventually, they said the same thing about the Rohingyas, the Burmese Muslims. And right now, they're saying the same thing about Uyghur Muslims. And now, are they going to say the same thing about Indian Muslims who are facing an imminent genocide? Till when do we raise our children with the highly immoral logic that their lives is simply about themselves and their careers and their own success? Till when do we continue to ignore the heart and soul of Islam, that we are but a single ummah that feels as one, that acts as one? A single spirit emanates us and flows within us and through us. Till when do we continue teaching our children that your success is measured by your paycheck and your zip code and your possessions, rather than your ability to do something good, just, ethical, moral? A small news item. Many Muslims are oblivious, because Muslims are very good at being oblivious, to the fact that not long ago, the UN appointed a special rapporteur to report on the conditions of Palestinians living under occupation in Israel. That rapporteur was named Richard Falk, himself a Jew. And he wrote a report describing Israel as an apartheid state, and Palestinians living under occupation as living under an apartheid system. The public activism the investment of money by people who raise their children very differently than the way we raise ours was so deafening that the UN was forced to force Richard Falk to withdraw his report. No, it wasn't highly influential people who accomplished this, but it was common Jewish kids in university campuses. Currently, the UN again responding to numerous reports of violations by Israelis against Palestinians, appointed a panel of 3 experts to report on the condition of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. And again, Israel has commenced a campaign to discredit and shut down whatever these 3 experts are going to say. While Muslims continue to be oblivious to the genocide against the Uyghur Muslims, the genocide perpetuated against Bosnian Muslims and against the Rohingyas, while Muslims continue to be largely oblivious to the plight of Palestinians and Jerusalem, because of events like Richard Falk's report and the recent appointment of an investigatory panel by the Human Rights Council in the UN, Israel has renewed yet another project It's known as the Hasbara campaign. That replaced a former campaign called Solomon's Sling. The English word for this campaign is the concert campaign. And basically, what this campaign is to dedicate anywhere from $40 million to $80 million to spend on people in the West who do nothing but defend and polish the image of Israel, right or wrong. The budget for this campaign, a small part of the budget comes from the Israeli government, but the majority of the budget comes from Jewish donors. The Hasbara campaign goes after anyone that brings attention to the reality of suffering, the reality of Palestinian suffering, or the reality of apartheid, the apartheid state that does exist in Israel. And spends money by recruiting students and activists and scholars to do nothing but polish the image of Israel. And here's the thing. The Hasbara campaign is not limited to spending on Jewish organizations to defend the reputation and image of Israel, but also includes spending on Muslims and Arabs who are willing to take money and say untrue and false things about Israel as long as they're positive. I want to just give you one example. As your children grow up to be selfish, self-absorbed, and self-centered, I want to share with you just the plight of one village called Deir Nizam in Palestine. Deir Nizam, a small Palestinian village in the West Bank, like so many other Palestinian villages, had Israel come in, confiscate their farms and their lands, confiscate I forgot how many, I think it was 600 dunams, sort of 600 plots or fields, to build a settlement, an illegal Israeli settlement called Nev Tazuf, which has about 1,500 Jewish settlers. After they stole this land from Palestinians, of course not compensating them a single dime, and building an illegal settlement and having 1,500 Jewish settlers come in and live in it, most of the settlers left their Wall Street jobs in the US, their jobs in law firms in the US, their jobs in banking system in the US, to go immigrate from America. They came from the US to settle, to displace Palestinians and settle on unlawfully stolen land. When the Palestinians started protesting, this small village started protesting, Israeli soldiers surrounded the village, laid siege to the village. No one is allowed to enter or exit from the village without going through numerous inspection checkpoints and numerous searches and numerous interrogations. But I wish it stopped there. One of the most disturbing things is their Nizam smuggled videos of Israeli soldiers storming their schools under the pretense of looking for students who threw stones at the illegal Jewish settlement. And the video shows Israeli soldiers beating a student in 11th grade, Palestinian student in 11th grade, and when his teacher tried to intervene to prevent the beating of the children, the Israeli soldiers beat the teacher. They stormed the school to date, in less than 1 year, 14 times. Each time, beating, harassing students and teachers and staff, arresting students without notice even to their parents. Some of the students are released, some haven't been released. Every Muslim out there who comes from immigrant parents, you could have been the Palestinian child being beaten by Israeli soldiers on camera. Are your children aware of that? Soon, there are going to be hundreds or thousands of children in India who will have their parents massacred and killed if they themselves are not killed. I am sure there are going to be sexual assaults and rapes and imprisonments and torture. Are your children aware that any of them could have been that suffering child in India? Do they grow up with this awareness? So, Israel, which already, by the way, suffocates Palestinians, there are no jobs in what counts as Palestine because Israel controls the economy. Wages are so low that the vast majority of Palestinians have to go and work in slave-like conditions. They have to apply for a permit to go work in Israel in for low-paying jobs under horrible conditions where they have to accept whatever the Israeli employer wants or demands or commands them to do. And the work permits are extremely expensive and very prevalent in the black market for exorbitant prices. So you work like a slave from dusk till dawn. Half of your wages are paid to the middleman who actually manages to sell you the work permit and who takes half of your salary. And Israel is very good. Every time someone points to the obvious and says, this is apartheid, you have first-class people in Israel, the Jewish people, who live by consistently and systematically abusing another ethnicity, Arabs, and another religion, Muslims, and anyone that points to this and says the obvious, this is apartheid. Israel has tons of donors who are willing to donate millions of dollars, and tons of students, just like your children, who are willing to dedicate their entire career to propagate and teach untruths and lies about Israeli democracy, which doesn't benefit Palestinians living under occupation. And yet, again, and for the millionth time, the reason your children don't have a moral example is because they often look to their parent and they find their parents are following the like of Hamza Yusuf, who has sold out to the Emiratis, who are now in bed with the colonizers of Palestine, with the Emiratis, who have not just sold out the Palestinians, but who have even sold out the Uyghur Muslims and sold out even before the genocide occurs proper. Because abuses continue every day against Muslims in India. But it's not a genocide yet. It will be. And yet the Emirati leadership has given Modi, the architect of the Hindu nationalistic, not fascist state, an award, and insists that any Muslim that speaks about the plight of Palestinians, the plight of the Uyghurs, the plight of the Kashmiris, the plight of Muslim Indians, insists that they're Ikhwan, they're Muslim Brotherhood, and they're terrorists, and that that's political Islam, and that the Islam they want is an Islam that doesn't say a word. In other words, an Islam that doesn't matter, an immoral Islam. An Islam that is identical to the very hedonistic logic of capitalism. Numb yourself. Enjoy your life. Don't think too deeply. Don't think about anything other than feeling good. If videos make you feel good, that's what the capitalist tells you. Buy it. Buy whatever makes you feel good. The Sufi, Emirati type Islam tells you, yeah, buy whatever you want. But on top of that, resort to some good old-fashioned mysticism, hedonistic, amoralistic mysticism, so you can feel good about yourself and your family. That's not Islam. That's not morality. That's not even logic. That's not even realism. It's absolutely nothing at all. Muslims whose hearts have observed too many slaughters, have observed too many atrocities against Muslims. I still remember the very details of the Bosnian genocide, of the rape camps. I still remember the very details of the Nakba. There's so many ways. I don't know how my system will bear to watch yet another genocide unfold against Muslims in India. Are we ever going to step up to the plate and actually make a difference? Are we ever going to teach our children that they have to make a difference? That it doesn't matter if they go to medical school, if ultimately all the money they make, they spend on themselves and their families, and on prestige and on appearances. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. اللهم اعف عنا. اللهم اغفر لنا. اللهم ارحمنا يا علي يا عظيم. واصلح حالنا يا رب. Allah, forgive our sins. Guide us to the straight path. Help us grow closer to you, Ya Allah. Help us be better Muslims and better human beings. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه يا رب العالمين وأقم الصلاة.